Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about anxiety. I'm going to give a quick definition, we're going to jump into some cognitive neuropsychology, I'm going to try to tie everything back into anxiety, and then we're going to hone in on trauma as a specific type of anxiety and different ways that we treat trauma, and hopefully that can give everyone a better understanding of what anxiety is exactly. So I would define anxiety as a neurobiological response to uncertainty or novelty or an anomaly. This is primarily taken from the work of Jeffrey Gray, and anxiety under this paradigm can be differentiated from fear or frustration, all three of which are negative emotions. So fear would be the anticipation of something painful or punishing, and frustration would be the disappointment that is felt when you are expecting to get something that you desire, that you want, but you don't get it. All three are related, but for me, it's just interesting, or it's useful in my mind to keep these three negative emotions segregated in that way. So we're going to focus on anxiety for this video. So first I want to talk about perception. James Gibson was a psychologist in the 20th century, and he had a theory of affordances. So he didn't believe that we saw the objective world or the objective reality in its fullness. He believed that we existed in an ecological environment. And just one example of that, if you think about a cup or a glass, you could think of it as a singular object, but really there are many objective facts about this object, and some would argue that there are an infinite number of objective facts about this object, talking about its thickness, the various dimensions, the way that it reflects light, the way that it sounds, and the way that it could sound. Now, this object can also be broken down into its atomic structure, its subatomic structure, each particle having its own position or perhaps its own momentum. And if I were to put this object on the table, well, the object's now part of the table, which is part of the room, which is a part of the apartment complex, and you can go on and on. And in reality, all of those properties that I just listed are facts, but we don't see them and we don't really care about them either. So Gibson believed that we saw affordances. We saw what objects afforded us. They were either tools or obstacles. They were positive affordances or negative affordances. You can think of an affordance as a meaning. It's a purpose. So this glass, it affords graspability, it affords drinkability, it affords placeability, I suppose. I can put it down on things. I can use it to hold down objects. Like it can be used as a paperweight. It has throwability. I can throw it. And you can go on and on. For Gibson, the meaning that we perceived in the world, specifically visually perceived in the world, but it could be extended to the other senses, it manifested as a result of the objective properties of the object that we're dealing with, but it also manifested because of our goals and our subjective properties. So he was a fan of embodied cognition. I don't think it's precise to say that, but it's good enough for now. The reason that the cup affords certain possibilities to me is because of the body that I have. I have hands and I can grab it. I'm a creature that drinks water. And so I have these various goals. I need to be able to drink. And so when I look out into the world, I see tools or obstacles, and both of those types of affordances, again, positive and negative affordances, have meaning to me. And that's exactly what I see. I don't see all of the objective facts. With this theory of perception, it's interesting to really highlight one of the things I just said, in that the world, the ecological environment, if you will, manifests to us as a result of our goals. Now, our goals, most of our goals are motivated. I would argue all of our goals are motivated. What does that mean? Well, the motivation is the drive to do something, and our motivations set our goals. Our motivations are primarily mediated by our hypothalamus, and Larry Swanson, who's a neuroscientist, placed the hypothalamus as a primary component of the motor system in our nervous system. And so it communicated with the cognitive systems, it communicates with the cognitive system, the sensory system, and it takes into account all the things that we need for our body to survive. So it uh, controls our motivational states, such as our hunger, our thirst, if we're too hot or too cold, our sexual behaviors, our repetitive behaviors, defensive behaviors, as well as exploratory behaviors. So our motivations set our goals, and our goals determine what affordances we see out in the world. Now, given this line of reasoning, we can also talk about, well, how do we learn to go and obtain these affordances? And here I would loop in Jean Piaget's theory of equilibration or equilibrated states. So Jean Piaget was a developmental psychologist. He was also called a genetic epistemologist. And so he was interested in how structures of knowledge formed themselves, or how we formed our knowledge structures. So he had this idea of equilibration, and it was a three-part process. So we're in an equilibrated state, meaning that essentially the knowledge structures that we have, he also called knowledge structure schemas, were good enough to help us navigate the world, whatever we were doing. We're accomplishing our goals. You can think of an infant just trying to feed or just trying to play with a toy. The initial equilibrated state is where we're at when what we expect to happen happens. Now, what happens is we encounter something that's anomalous, a novelty, something that's different, and our current schemas aren't sufficient to deal with that anomalous phenomenon in an adaptable way. So Piaget said that we're in our equilibrated state, we encounter novelty, we're in a disturbed state or a disequilibrated, we're knocked off balance. There's many terms that he used, but we're in a state of disturbance. And so now we have to adapt either through assimilation or accommodation, which are just two forms of adaptation that he asserted. And we create a new schema, and this new schema is more complex, it's more sophisticated. We essentially learn. We're able to take in that new information for that novelty that we encountered, and we generate a new schema that's better than the old one. And throughout the developmental cycle, from birth all the way up into adulthood, we have these structures of knowledge that you could think about as hierarchical, where you have those initial schemas that you're building in the world, whether it's just grabbing a cup or it's trying to identify, your mother. Those initial schemas are the bedrock, the substrate for more shallow schemas that you build up on top of them. So we have foundational schemas that are our most general schemas, are our most foundational. They are the ones that many other schemas are dependent on, and then we have more shallow schemas. But for Piaget, the equilibration process was how we went about learning how to deal with affordances in the world. Now, the next thing I want to tie in is memory. So our hippocampus does a few things, but one of the things that it does is it generates a fantasy or a model of the world that we want to have happen. So we have these knowledge structures, we have these goals, and we have some knowledge of different affordances that we seek out or ones that we want to avoid. Again, if we go off of James Gibson's assertion that we don't see the world, but we see this ecological environment, you can think that part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the amount of potential or the amount of possibilities that we need to deal with in the world. So when I look at the cup, as long as my goals are correct, as long as I'm healthy, I just see one thing, and I psychologically encounter the cup as a singular object, as a thing to drink from. I see one affordance. But in reality, there are many, many affordances that the cup can have, and there are many meanings that can manifest to me. But as long as I'm obtaining my goals and I'm properly motivated, then the cup is just one thing. As long as my schemas are working, as long as I'm not in that state of disturbance, or as long as I'm not knocked off balance from a Piagetian perspective, then my schemas are working, I'm not anxious, and everything is fine. So part of what our memory system has adapted to do is it generates a model of the world. It takes these schemas, and we set a goal in our mind, and it creates a model of the world that we desire to have happen. Now, the hippocampus is also tracking our sense data. So you could think of it as the hippocampus is comparing two sets of data. One is internal data. It's the desired model of the world you want to have happen. And then another model is created from the sense data that you're also taking in. Now, as long as these two models are correct or are aligned and they're matching, everything's fine. But if there's a mismatch, that's when you become anxious. Your hippocampus starts to activate different cascading biological interactions and dynamics, and you get heightened arousal. You start to engage in exploratory activity. First, you have orienting reflex, and you're um, trying to figure out what's going on. Because again, I'm saying that anxiety is a biological response to uncertainty. So that's what your memory system. That's a primary function of your memory system. It is to take your past experience, generate a model of the world that you want to have happen, and instead of trying to deal with all the endless potential affordances out in the world, it just uses that model and it pushes you to act out in behavior and perception that model, and it just tracks deviations from that model rather than you having to make everything up as you go. So that was somewhat of a tie-in of anxiety. Again, anxiety, response to uncertainty. We don't see the entire world. The entire world has an endless number of facts and just things we don't care about. So we constrain the world, but the outside reality is still there. So we use our schemas to pursue affordances, and that helps us constrain the amount of uncertainty we have to deal with. But if those schemas don't work, well, then we have to learn. And to learn is to encounter the potential of reality again, to gain certain knowledge so that way we can recreate our schemas or make more adaptable schemas that we can then use in the future. So anxiety is crucial in learning, but it's also something that can be overwhelming if it's faced too much. If you are faced with it too much, if you're faced with too much of it. All right, final thing we're going to talk about is trauma. Read a great book recently by Ronnie Janoff Bowman called Shattered Assumptions, and she believed that trauma was what someone experienced when a fundamental schema was proven to be incorrect. So one fundamental schema that most people have is that the world is a good place. Well, if something tragic happens to you, or if something malevolent happens to you, which would be the intentional harm uh, inflicted on you by another person, well, as we mentioned, the way your knowledge structures are set up, they're hierarchical. So you have some fundamental schemas upon which many other schemas rest. So if you dissolve one of those fundamental schemas, well, all of those other knowledge structures that organize your patterns of behavior and perception in the world are dissolved. They dissolve as well. And what comes rushing into you is that infinite potential of all the different affordances and all the different objective facts that could be out there in the world because you don't know anything else. And so one of the ways that we treat trauma is through exposure therapy. And exposure therapy facilitates the process of learning. It helps your body assimilate and accommodate that new information that you received, the new traumatic information that you were unaware of, into more sophisticated schemas. So that way you are more prepared to contend with the world with these new knowledge structures and given that new knowledge. So to sum up, you can think of trauma as an extreme form of anxiety. We have these knowledge structures, these schemas that we overlay onto the world. And as long as everything's going the way that we think they're supposed to go or the way that we want them to go, everything's fine. But as soon as there's a mismatch between your internal model of the world and the external model of the world, that's when you become anxious. That's where you start to orient. That's where your energy starts to get heightened and you're trying to figure out what's happening because your nervous system is telling you that you're in the unknown, you're in a state of non-equilibrium, and in this state, in this chaos, in this darkness, you could die. So you have to figure something out, and your nervous system doesn't stop talking to you or stop bugging you, which is why when people experience trauma, they often get re-experiencing um, situations or instances where they dream about it, they have nightmares about the instance, they have intrusive thoughts or just images of the situation pop up in their mind. That's their nervous system trying to tell them, hey, we have to learn something. And so That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's my spiel on anxiety. Thank you all for listening.